democratization of the medium, both for creators and for users.
Great. Yeah. And my name is Kent Bai, and I do the Voices of VR podcast. And so for the last going on almost 7 years now, I've been going to different conferences around the world and coming up on episode 1000 of the Voices of VR podcast here soon with the next month or so. But as I was talking to the community, there's organically things coming up around ethics and privacy, what happens to our data. And so it's a little bit with like the new technology, it allows all these new capabilities, but also has these new threats. And so how do you balance the benefits from the harms, and how do you weigh against, those different, costs and benefits against each other across these different contexts? And that's a lot of what I've been looking at in different ways on my podcast, but also been involved in certain initiatives like the IEEE's global initiative on the ethics of extended reality that have been helping try to bring more people from the industry to be able to have these discussions and try to, figure out some ethical design principles to help us create some guardrails to navigate this in an ethical way.
Yeah, I definitely think that this is like an incredible initiative that people should definitely reach out to Kent to get involved in. And if you're working in the VR space, or if you love playing VR games, just, looking into the future and thinking, what does our involvement mean? And I know that, in 5-10 years from now, when VR and AR hit real serious ubiquity, I'd love to see this be a source of empowerment and unification, and a tool for equity and general improvement of the human condition. So yeah, I think this is one of the most important things that we can talk about as we shape this medium.
That's fantastic. So I think there was a slideshow, a presentation that we can sort of like go through and sort of like start to focus in on a lot of these different questions, because I know that we were talking about this beforehand, and there is a lot to think about when it does come to what's being said, who needs to say what, and like even like the small like pieces of data that come across, I think is very interesting to see that goes into it. So Kent, I think if you can go ahead and let's look through some of the stuff.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to be kind of walking through some of the different slides here, and then opening up for group discussion here amongst my fellow panelists here. So the ethics of extended reality is a discussion that we're having here today. Again, my name is Kent Bai. I do the Voices of VR podcast. So we'll be covering like the 3 sections here. What is extended reality? Some of the larger socio-political context of the technology, and then we'll be diving into our group discussion around, exploring the different contexts and the different ethical and moral dilemmas that we see with XR. So first, what is extended reality? So there's a spectrum that Milgram came up with. It's called the mixed reality spectrum. And on one end, you have real reality, and on the other end, you have virtual environments. And you see this kind of blending together of these two, where on the far left, you have total physical reality with no augmentation. And then you have augmented reality, something like Pokemon Go, which blends together the context of the real world with a little bit of the virtual environment. And then on the far extreme, you're completely immersed within virtual reality. And you still have your physical body, of course, in physical reality. And then sometimes here you have mixed reality, but generally this whole spectrum is referred to as the mixed reality spectrum. And then also extended reality, or XR, all of the Rs. And then, if we look at the left side, we have the physical world, and the right side, we have the digital world. This is Microsoft. They have the Microsoft HoloLens, augmented reality. And then on the right, we have virtual reality. So I think the key thing here is that on the augmented reality, you're still grounded in the context of where you're at in the world, and you're overlaying different layers of augmentation to kind of slightly modulate your context. Whereas VR, you're completely shifting in a completely new context. And so what's that mean to be able to, in one moment, go from one context to the next and feel like you're fully immersed and actually fully there? And just overall, VR represents all these existing mediums, from video games to human-computer interaction and web design and narrative design, mobile design, and cinematic storytelling, and theater and architecture. And it's including all these things together. But it's specifically having your sense of embodiment and sense of presence that really tricks all your sensory perceptions that you're in another world. In this last slide of this section, I'll just sort of show like what is actually happening is like this level of perceptual engineering with virtual and augmented reality, where it's able to filter our perceptions and with our cognitions have selective attention and use that in certain ways. And then finally, the action is ways in which that is modulating our actions as we're taking in the world. So it's the full loop of our perception, cognition, and action. And XR technologies are integrating into all of this. And so it's literally like helping to shape our reality. So I'll pause there for a second and kind of open up for any thoughts about, as we start to define what XR is and what sort of comes up for you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a beautiful visual to help us get started. The thing that kind of comes to mind for me with this is, as we're talking about like hacking perception, that definitely, this is on a spectrum, right? We experience virtual worlds through screens, whether that's social media or traditional entertainment, and then this is on the more immersive end of the spectrum with AR and then VR and future technologies like sort of read-write brain-computer interfaces, which are still definitely the work of science fiction, but are being worked on and developed at this point. I think when we look at the kinds of issues that we're seeing in screen technologies, these same kinds of issues are amplified and existent, but amplify the impact of them as we move up this spectrum with more and more immersion.
Yeah, one follow-on note that I'd say on that is that with the screen technologies, it's reached a scale of billions of phones that are out there, and that XR is still relatively small. And so you don't see as vast network effects of things going wrong, amplifying out to all of humanity in quite the same way as we do with all the other communication media and social media and our cell phones and everything else. But if the technological roadmap is on this trajectory of mass ubiquity, then it's within the next 5 or 10 years that the issues that we've been dealing with in the 2D realm are going to be replicated in these immersive technologies, but potentially amplified to be even worse. And so we're doing all we can to sort of like look at where the writing on the wall may be heading. So yeah, Robert, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this up to this point.
No, we're just going through a lot of just sort of the questions that we have from the audience. We're just sort of seeing like what is happening, what is going into it. Please continue. I'll let you know as soon as any of those questions happen to come up. But
great.
Go for it.
Cool. Yeah. So sounds like Robert will be listening to any of the questions that you're having. So feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll be integrating them here in our discussion. So I wanted to sort of set a larger like socio-political context of the technology, because I think as we talk about a lot of these things like filter bubbles of reality and all the hacking of democracy, I think there's like these larger questions that come up in terms of what is the relationship between all these different things. And there's two models I wanted to just put out there to help sort of frame the larger discussions here. One is Lawrence Lessig's approach, and then there's a nested context. So let me dive into Lessig's approach first. So Lessig has the pathetic dot theory, where he's basically saying that we have the cultural norm, like us, we're here in the center. And as we're here in the center, there's these four large things that are impacting our lives. It's the laws, it's the market dynamics and the economy, it's the cultural norms of society, and then you have the technological architecture and the code. And that, once you get large enough, then, the technological architecture code will actually shift the culture. But overall, the cultural norms are kind of influencing what the laws are, what the market is, and what technologies even developed. And so another way of looking at this same concept is to have it as sort of like this hierarchy of contexts. At the largest context, you have the culture, which is, all of the different ways of mainstream culture and counterculture and how those are kind of clashing together and evolving and changing over time. And that informs our laws that get formed. And then from there, those laws form the economy and the larger market context. And then within that market context, we have these design guidelines for different technologies that we have, sort of the ethical guidelines would live here. And then from there, you have the actual user experiences in the context of these, application, the code, operating system, and then the hardware and the technology. And so you can see that, the technology is within the context of all these other things. and that this is just another way of kind of looking at this. And when I think a lot of the ethical issues is, to what degree should things happen at the cultural level because we are just human beings? What do we need to change the laws? Where's the economy come into play? And then what can you do with changing the underlying technological architecture and the code that's going to sort of lead to a different result? And so another way of just looking at this is that there's high level human rights principles that are feeding into the governments and the laws. And then you have the XR companies and the hardware, and those are connected to the users and the experiences that we have. And then coming here into the side are these, ethical design principles that don't really exist in any robust fashion right now. And that's, with these new technologies, we have to try to figure out how are we going to create new laws if we need them? How are we going to say, hey, this is or is not okay for what the XR companies should be doing with this technology? And then at the experienced creators, which is maybe a lot of people here in this audience, what are the things that you should know in terms of just as you're creating experiences, how do you create something that's in the most ethical way that you possibly can? So yeah, so that's just sort of the larger context, and we'll be, I think, digging into this in a little bit more. But I'll pause there again, because I think we'll be coming back to this as we have these discussions. We sort of, there's always this part of what part is the culture, what part is what can we do with the technological architecture? Because there's a lot of ways in which that we want to think that if we just change the technology, we can engineer bad behavior out, and we just have enough AI, or we have just things automated enough, we'll be able to kind of fix humans and bad behavior. But I think what we find is that if humans want to be bad, then they're going to find a way to be bad, despite what other kind of guardrails you try to have from a technological architecture and code. And so it's always some sort of combination of all these things. So I'll pause there and get any feedback or comments.
Yeah,
I'll go for it. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, definitely the thing that I love about that graphic is showing those feedback loops between these different things. And we've seen so much dramatic culture shift based on the virtualization of our world and our social world, mainly within this past year. A lot of things have become virtualized, and a lot of people are we've had virtual monetary systems for a while, but this past year has seen a huge uptick in that, and that does create a feedback. And when you have folks designing these different kinds of tools to experience that, then the vessel shapes the communication as well. And that's why part of this is a big call to have more diverse development groups, have people who can anticipate different kinds of issues earlier on. And just like in nature, a diverse biome is more resilient. We see the same thing within the technology space.
Looking at some of the graphs that you have there, I'm sure that we have a lot of people obviously on Twitch right now trying to piece together what is the responsibility of the platform versus the responsibility of the government going into it. What do you see as sort of the forefront push that we should be looking towards? Is it that we should be looking at getting laws into effect in order to create the behavior that we're looking for, or is it up to the platforms in order to sort of lead the charge that will hopefully become something of a model as you're taking it up sort of the chain going into government?
Yeah, the way that I think about this is I was at a AI conference, and they're having this debate around at what point should you deploy something out into the world. If it's AI that's getting out there that could potentially be taking lives and killing people, then that question as to how much you're going to be rapidly iterating and kind of move fast and break things is going to be different than if you want to put something out into the world and learn from it and be able to adapt. And then there's the question of, to what degree do we know that things are going to be really bad, so we should sort of completely block off some certain aspects of the technology? Whereas if you do that, then do you do it in a way that is not context sensitive enough so that you may be preventing medical applications from happening? If you just say, hey, we're not going to have any biometric data come from these technologies, and you just sort of full stop, don't allow anybody in the world to be able to do that, well, there may be some situations where you actually want that, and people who are users would want to consent upon that. And so what degree do we allow people to consent to be able to have this versus how much should the government step in and say, hey, you know what, we should not allow this to happen because it's too dangerous in certain ways. So the tension there is that to what degree should we regulate versus let the innovation happen? And I think what Thomas Metzinger, as a philosopher, he said is that right now we have this technological pacing gap, which is that the pace of technology is so fast that the conceptual frameworks and the complexity that's involved is far exceeding any of the regulatory ability to kind of model what that is. And so the interface between the government and these technologies is kind of super imbalanced. Anybody who's watched our politicians here in the United States question anybody about technology, we know that they're at least 5 to 10 years behind where technology is right now, let alone for what the bleeding edge of technology is and where it's going in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's kind of in some sense, a dire situation in like, how do you close this gap? Do we need more like laws that are set that have that expire after time? Do we need to rapidly iterate? Do we need to have more like A/B testing in terms of, certain policies that are on small scales and then, expand that out in some ways? There's a lot of ways in which that we don't know what any of that really looks like. What we do know is that there's already a lot of these massive issues that we already have with technology that we had, 5, 10 years ago that have sort of reached a scale of the population that is starting to have these network effects of these issues. So how to turn one of those dials, whether it's the market dynamics or the culture, the responsibilities of people and being educated and versus what laws have to be set versus what are the underlying technological architectures that have to be there to be able to set these larger dynamics.
Yeah, I think we also see, and this plays into the speed of governance that Kent touched on, is that a lot of the legal side of things is set by precedent. And the kinds of precedent that are available are more around antitrust than any of the other issues that are existent. And so we're using what I would say is kind of the wrong terminology to even have these discussions at a large scale. Yeah, well, I mean, you'll see some of the upcoming issues that aren't really widely discussed in politics. And even, when we talk about, this is kind of outside of the VR space, but when we talk about jobs and job security, this is something that a lot of American politicians, love to talk about because the American public's concerned about it. But when we see politicians having these discussions, it is much more around whether that's like centered around immigration than it is around automation. And I don't think that we have the right tools to talk about the kinds of radical changes that are going to happen in the future. And that's part of why we have discussions like this, right? Is to try to develop that kind of language as well. Yeah.
So for the people watching right now, like what are some of the actions or what can they start looking into to sort of help propel some of this stuff forward, because we are looking at sort of a almost like a grassroots effort. So maybe from the audience, and then think about what are we looking from like the creator side of things.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good segue to go into some of these specific issues, because if there's anything I've learned in looking at these issues is how context dependent they are, and depending on what issue you're looking at is going to determine what vector point you're going to be entering in and talking about this. So maybe I'll kick off the larger discussion by starting to kind of go through some of these different contexts. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. So the next section is just setting the context for the larger discussion about XR ethics. And just as I said, all the different context dependent aspects of, as I've put together this XR ethics manifesto, there's lots of different contexts, whether it's yourself, your biometric data, your home, entertainment, medical information, government, or your education, lots of different contexts here. And for each of these areas, there's lots of different issues. I mean, we're just going to be kind of scratching the surface here, but this kind of graph gives you some sense about how broad of a scope these different types of discussions can happen. But maybe we just start on, I'll give two and then we'll kind of open it up. I think the one aspect is what avatars you have. And so this is probably more on the cultural level in terms of, you know, like you want to have a diverse representation of different avatars people can be able to embody. You don't want to be feeling like someone is a certain race or gender, that they don't have any sort of avatar representations available within your experience. But also, what are the ethics around who you embody? And, you know, is there like a sort of digital blackface that can happen where if you are embodying avatars that are different from your identity, is that okay to play with that? And in what context does that start to be kind of questionable in terms of, you know, how you may be doing some of these, you know, avatars that you have in certain contexts? And so avatar embodying, but also the psychological impact of avatars on your psyche. And maybe I'll just pause it there, because I think that's sort of brought up a lot of different issues there. But I think avatar embodiment is certainly going to be a huge issue, and already is. But there's certainly, you know, some ethical issues there as well that are probably more at the cultural level.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like a sort of, this started out in the gaming space. This was like, of the different things that feed into VR, this is very much a gaming thing. And we've seen this kind of thing in games for a while, where it's like, you know, if you're a woman gamer and you're logging in, like, what are the options for how women are being represented in games, and then, you know, down the rabbit hole from there. And I think, I mean, we're seeing also like a lot of experimentation around what avatars can be like, where, you know, if you guys have tried Spatial, which is it's like a VR co-working kind of experience. You literally just take a picture of your face, and that becomes the texture for the face of your avatar. And that's, you know, that's trying to be more true to yourself, but I also just don't think that's necessarily the right way to do things. For one thing, it looks super rough. And yeah, and I think there's also this element of exploration, right? Like I don't, like, when I play games, I don't try to make my avatar look exactly like me. And I think people are, you know, in virtual worlds, are exploring other kinds of identities. And so, you know, the kinds of options that are given there are definitely, it's important to have a diverse art department there who can, you know, think about what the different options are.
And I think it's probably worth mentioning that in some applications like VR chat, how much of a cultural norm it has become for males to embody female avatars in a way that it is like disproportionate to what you would expect the percentages to be. There may be a historical like evolution for how that is in terms of what avatars got ported over early on, but there's also just like a critical mass of people, but also just the playing of gender that is happening, where I've noticed that when people refer to people in these virtual spaces, they almost default to they, them pronouns, just because they don't actually know if they may hear a certain voice and they project what gender they may think it is, but they don't, if they're embodying a female avatar, then there's this kind of interesting new normative standards that have been developing within some of these different social platforms that I've noticed that are kind of interesting to see as well, that I think may be of interest to this gay gamers community as well.
So what do you see as sort of like the next sort of steps going into avatars? Like what are some of the elements that you would like to see going forward? Are we looking at something that's more representative of the person, or are we looking for something that's more representative of maybe like the inner self? Because there is a sense of a lot of people who do go online and they don't want to reflect like what they are in real life. Sometimes it is a chance to go out to experiment, but it is also a chance to just, you know, be a part of like the crowd itself. So how do you manage to give people both freedom as well as protect the individuality of the person while going into these virtual spaces?
I think that's a great question. Part of it, so there's two different kinds of like ways to make avatars, I guess. One, and obviously this lies on a spectrum as well. One is where basically like an art department will offer a bunch of different options. So like a bunch of different eye colors, hairstyles, all that, body types, etc. And maybe there are, you know, sliders between these that can offer more choices. And then there's sort of like generative design where you have avatars being sort of spun up algorithmically. I think, you know, if you're going to offer a bunch of choices, you get into this like tricky area where you're probably going to be missing something. And I mean, the thing that comes to mind is like, I've used a lot of avatar builders that were created in Asia, and they have like many, many, many different kinds of K-pop hairstyles and no sort of offerings for like the African-American community. And it's just really hard to hit all the things that your community might want. And also like transferring between cultures is really tricky with that. And the generative design stuff I haven't like dipped as deeply into, but I think that's an interesting space that could offer some solutions.
Yeah, the Museum of Other Realities has a really nice generative avatar system. And when I looked at something like VR Chat, which has like literally millions of different avatars that people are uploading, and if there's any trends that I see, you can go to the virtual market and kind of see the new avatars. But I see a lot more animals and mixtures of like sort of hybrid animals in different ways, and that's some part like some influence of the furry community, but also just people want to embody different animals that have different symbolic meaning for whatever those animals may be. And so things like that, where it's a lot of non-humanoid or non-human types of avatar representations that, I mean, it starts to kind of reflect a certain amount of socioeconomic status as well. As like, do you have a default avatar, or do you have an avatar that is customized? There's a kind of like these social hierarchies that are in some of these virtual worlds as well that, yeah, some of something like Altspace is an example where they just say, we're not going to let you do anything super fancy. You're just going to have everything more egalitarian. But the more egalitarian is a trade-off between you really expressing yourself. So I think that's sort of like the ethical issues that kind of come up is that there's different trade-offs and there's different decisions that different platforms will make. And based upon that decision, we'll come up with different dynamics where, you know, like Burning Man is at Altspace VR, whereas VR Chat is like really kind of like the Wild West in terms of people experimenting with like more and more extreme levels of avatar representations that would not be acceptable on these other platforms. And so I think if anything, we want to just have a diversity of different ways of people making those different choices so that there's a variety of different options and different social dynamics that come out of each of those.
How are we, what are some of the forefronts? Like we're talking about diversity, both like in avatars, but like, let's talk about diversity within the audience itself. Like, what are some of the maybe some of the tech, some of the rules, what is happening to help out with diversity within this world in order to make it both safer for people who are going into it, as well as safer for people who are creating it?
Well, I know that there's certainly certain issues in terms of like people of color, their hairstyles actually sometimes physically don't work with some of the headsets. And so like they're having to figure out alternative like physical hardware in order to like make it comfortable and usable for all a variety of different hairstyles. I think if I were to like abstract out like the general principles is that as you start to build both the hardware technology as well as the software, making sure you have a diverse set of different people that are playtesting it, because a lot of times it only takes a handful of people that are from an underrepresented minority or group that, you know, has a chance to have an experience or try the technology, and they're just like, well, this doesn't work for me for this reason. And so I think in terms of ensuring that there is diversity at a minimum, making sure that people that are testing it out, but ideally the people who are actually on the teams making these experiences, so that you have more people at the table at these decisions, having more diverse teams that are creating these experiences, which can within itself help to prevent a lot of those things from, you know, more downstream where it may be harder to fix later. So those are at least, you know, and equity and funding and all those different things are big, complicated issues. I'm sure Fifer is probably an area where she's been digging into this in terms of like funding and creating content as well. But, you know, just the larger ecosystem is very cisgendered, very white, very much of privilege. And so there's larger issues in terms of how to like shift that. And I think at the bottom line is money and funding, which requires these different institutions or other ways of kind of channeling that. But Fifer, I don't know if you have more more insight on that.
Yeah, for sure. So I have kind of two pickup things from there. So one of the things that I would say definitely for this community is if you have the opportunity to get involved in like youth programs, if you can like go and, share a class at like a community college or something like that, that can be so transformative for people, because a lot of folks, myself included, like have had this have had some like catalyzing experience where they realized, oh, I can be part of this industry. And for me, that was, at this, when I was like in middle school and high school, there was a free program and it would teach you how to do filmmaking and some game creation. And I was like, oh, wow, like I can totally do this. And I think like those kinds of like creating just like small seeds in your community where people get access to this tech is really great, and can just have such a big ripple effect, because it's really hard to get diversity in teams if there's like large communities that never felt empowered to be making this, from a younger age. And then, yeah, I forgot the other part of the later part of that. We were talking about, oh yes. And in terms of, so that's like in terms of just like creating access, I think there's a big, like, there's a lot of people who don't even have internet access in the US still, which is kind of a larger issue. And in terms of like the socioeconomic stuff, there, like, education is really, I think, the key to this, which is great because we're going to also have a little session on education later today.
It's true. So with sort of like what we're looking at in the sort of the XR area, I think we've touched a lot on the VR section of it, but like let's like focus a little bit on AR as well. Like, what, if you can describe what is sort of AR, what are some of the things that you're looking into, and like what are some of the hurdles or big questions we need to be asking ourselves as we're starting to get into this world?
If you'd like, maybe it's worth me just kind of running through the rest of my slides, and then I think there's a part of, and then we can kind of broaden up to the larger discussion. Since I got through the first slide, but we can sort of go through some of these other issues and kind of pick and choose, because there are some very specific AR related things. But let me dig into here to kind of give an overview of the overall landscape, and then we'll dig in more here. Okay, so the next big thing is the biometric data, which I think that not only information that this immersive technologies, whether it's virtual or augmented reality, is going to be having access to not only our body, our biometric data, our eye gaze information, our galvanic skin response, and so much intimate information about our body that could be extrapolated out into a variety of different pieces of what they refer to as biometrically inferred information or biometric psychographic information. So just as an example, you can look at like your eye, how your eyes are moving. So a lot of, like, say, Magic Leap or HoloLens, they both have eye tracking technologies. And so, what happens to that data and what can you extrapolate from that, especially if you are aware of the world around you. So you have like just these different primary things of your eye movement, your saccades, your pupil size, all these different aspects. And then you can extrapolate from that and infer gender, age, your identity, your health, different aspects of your mental health and skills and abilities, and your cognitive load, cognitive processes. And so really, like, when you have access to eye tracking technology, especially when it's combined to all the other biometric information, it's a real threat to our sense of mental privacy. And just to kind of extrapolate that out a little bit more, there's a whole human rights approach called neurorights. And this is a paper that was put together by a number of folks who are having this neuroethics initiative, when they're saying, here's some fundamental human rights that we want to have: the right to identity, right to agency, right to mental privacy, right to fair access to mental augmentation, as well as the right to protection from algorithmic bias. So we see these high-level rights, and if we go, back to this previous slide I had before, you have these human rights principles, and then the big challenge is how do you translate these human rights principles of, say, like the right to mental privacy down into, how the technology companies are operating and how we ensure that as users we have our mental privacy protected. Because just to kind of blow out how complicated this can start to get, there's a lot of stuff that's happening here, but you have the companies here that have all the different technology. You have these human rights and this neuro rights initiative and the right to mental privacy that's feeding into these ethical design principles. And by the way, anything that's red here doesn't quite exist yet, or is more speculative. Like we may need to have new federal privacy laws because the existing laws don't cover any of this data yet. So that if we do have new laws, that would feed into the governments and sort of have potentially close down some of these different vectors, which is, the biometric psychography and contextually aware AI, this surveillance capitalism business model that would be potentially a new revenue stream for these companies, that not only the app store and selling the hardware, but to take that data from us and find ways to turn it into advertising, or, to understand our behaviors in a way that they could predict our behaviors. And if they could predict behaviors, they could potentially help nudge our behaviors or control our behaviors in certain ways. And then also, as we have the third-party developers, anyone who's creating these experiences, they're going to also potentially have access to this user context and user data. And just like, Cambridge Analytica with Facebook, that was an example of a lot of intimate private information that got into the hands of what it eventually became a state actor that was using that for information warfare. So to what degree, if this information is being recorded, does that get into the hands? And there's developer terms of service, but how that is actually, is it an operating system layer that prevents some of this stuff from being transferred over? So there's a lot of just moving vectors that are involved in just a simple issue or a very complicated issue of mental privacy. But this gives you a little bit of a sense of all this, and the European Union and everything else that is also feeding into all this ecosystem. But just to kind of go through some of the other different issues that come up. So in augmented reality, you have the ability to kind of shift your context. To what degree are other people being augmented with their identity? And to what degree is it aware of your context to do contextually aware advertising in different ways? And this kind of just general visual clutter that, is that going to be distracting to people in certain ways? And you have volumetric privacy. So if you have augmented reality things happening within your home, then there may be information that is in your home that is then, if you have products that are there, does that mean that a company could scan to see what existing products you have in your home? Or if you have shared spaces, then, there's certain ways that your privacy is actually collective shared privacy with other people. So you could be violating your other people's privacy by going into, their spaces as well. Then you have just like consent to augment. So you have this whole thing where when Pokemon Go was out, you had the Holocaust Museum where people were playing Pokemon Go within the Holocaust Museum. So then to what degree does the Holocaust Museum have the right to say, don't play this, or prevent, do they have to go to Pokemon Go, or is there some way that they could declare what is or is not okay to be able to augment within their space? Does that all come down to property rights? And if it does come down to property rights, does that mean that the people who own property are the only ones who can make augmentations? So that is balanced against like free speech dimensions there. So yeah, public and private property and all those different dimensions there is another issue that comes up with augmented reality. So distractions. So what happens when you create an augmented reality experience and then someone walks off a cliff or ends up getting killed? Who's at fault? What are the liabilities? How do you ensure that you are contextually aware so that you're not putting people in danger? The escapism issue of to what degree are you creating experiences that just are kind of getting people into these addictive loops and not and like loot boxes and gambling, or to what, and a lot of the addiction is to what degree are they in right relationship with the people around them? Virtual violence. So what's it mean to start to have these virtual ways that you're embodying these characters, but also exhibiting violence in a way that maybe go beyond the 2D version that is abstracted when you're actually embodying it? Then are there new levels of either triggering trauma or making new traumas within these virtual environments? Motion sickness is a big issue that virtual reality has to deal with, and how to mitigate those as one of the design considerations that folks should be concerned with. medical XR ethics. If you can cause PTSD, then if you can cure PSD, then you can potentially cause PTSD. But there's going to be a lot of data that is coming from this technologies that are going to be potentially revealing medical conditions. And is there a responsibility for, say, Facebook to report to you whether or not you have any indications of some of these medical conditions, and how does that get navigated? The dual use of technology for using technology for bringing about lethal force, and what are the lines between that? Virtual beings and the ways that virtual beings are influencing us in different ways. Virtual harassment and how to mitigate from harassment, and ways that to kind of create safe online spaces. And there's certain elements that are technological, but there's also a cultural element. So how do you manage both of those? Moderation and a code of conduct to be able to make sure that people are following a certain ways of operating and engaging with each other that is creating a safe online space. This is just like intersecting axes of privilege. And so whether it's from race or gender, or your sexuality, your age, there's lots of different privileged ways. And then there's ways that those could be oppressed, or those minorities or different areas that just culturally are receive oppression. So how do we deal with some of these different issues, especially when you have something like algorithmic bias that may be encoding some of these different biases within the actual algorithms and reinforcing some of these. And so looking at the data sets, making sure they're representative, but also making sure, like we were talking about earlier, how to ensure that the systems that you're designing aren't amplifying these and bringing more undue harm for certain populations. And then finally, just the accessibility. So making sure that the technology that we're creating is as accessible as we can make it. And it's not just for able-bodied folks, but that we have different accessibility options. And I think this is a little bit more of an emerging area for XR, because there's been a lot of focus of making it work for able-bodied folks first. And now there's going to be, how do we make sure that it's as inclusive as we can for, the different range of different abilities that we have. So that's sort of like an overview. Maybe from there, I'll stop sharing and we can go back to discussion. Sorry if I overwhelmed, but there's certainly a lot that I want to sort of set the context, and sort of from there we can sort of just chat.
That is a huge amount to go through. Fifer, what from everything that we just sort of went through, what do you think is sort of what are the big concerns for you? Like, what are you looking into the most right now? I know that is we're basically opening up seemingly Pandora's box in a lot of ways for this, but like what are the first steps, or what are like the big challenges that you're looking at?
So I think this is an awesome overview of all these different things, of like different issues that we see within the VR space. And it's important to find the sort of levers that can deal with a bunch of things at once. So one of the levers that we touched on earlier is having a diverse development team. So if you have a diverse development team, then you're going to, have more diversity in testing to make sure that the experiences you're creating aren't going to be traumatic to somebody, even if you didn't think that they were going to be traumatic. That's the kind of, that's one thing that it covers. It also covers, algorithmic bias is generally created by, can generally be detected by people who understand that it might be there. And so, even if your data sets are creating that kind of bias to begin with, it's still possible to deal with that. It's not inevitable, right? A lot of, people think that, you take a large data set and then, that's going to be a good indicator of truth. And that's obviously not. The movie Coded Bias that Kent Bai had on his slide just came out on Netflix, and I highly encourage you to watch that. And Joy, who's featured in the film, she does a lot of work in combating that. And so, I think that part of it is that education component, and ensuring that, we get more different kinds of people in the tech space who aren't necessarily perpetuating old paradigms that aren't going to serve us. And as well as the other kind of element, which also stems from diversity, right? Which is like, what are our business models and how do we, what is our incentive structure? Like, I think a lot of these things around, whether how we want to design experiences come down to, is this a business model where people are in the game or in the experience for a long time, and the goal is to keep them there as long as possible. And that can be really problematic. I know somebody commented and said that they thought the slide around like addiction was really disturbing, and it definitely is. I think, yeah, like that stems from a business model of attention and like the attention economy. And if we can, be creative, and of course this comes back to the feedback cycle between market and the law, it's tricky, right? Because we've found that the attention economy is incredibly lucrative, and it's hard for, especially like in the gaming tech space, if you're a startup and you're trying to do something different, you generally have venture capital who are telling you to follow business models that are proven and, make the return on the investment. And so, yeah, I'm wondering, Ken, if you have any examples or knowledge of companies that are, doing this differently and breaking the mold and offering some alternatives.
Well, I think that generally here in the United States, the type of regulation is very loose. So I think across the board, as a culture, we tend to innovate. We preference the innovation above and beyond the protection. And I think in some ways that we have this opportunity where there is this like explosion of different things that are possible, but it's like a little bit of the Wild West, and there's a bit of a luxury of that. And I think as the harms come up, then it's a matter of trying to like name those harms and identify those harms. Like there was a whole, with harassment that women were facing within virtual environments. And, then it became clear that it was essential to have personal space bubbles and to have the blocking features within these environments. And that if you didn't have those those are like the baseline in terms of creating these safe spaces, because if you are in an environment and you don't feel like you're threatened, or it doesn't bother you that people are being intrusive in your space, well, that, for some people that could be highly traumatizing for kind of triggering existing traumas, or just generally having their private spaces invaded in that way. Then you have to kind of adapt. And I think there's been a bit of that iterative approach where we have to, like, we see just put the technology out there, and it's a little bit of this Wild West, experimentation and harms being done, but then trying to listen to those harms and then feed that back into the design loop cycle. So I'd say, what happened with the early iterations with harassment and the personal space bubbles is one example of that. But I think generally, as you go from small to large, then, I mean, one of the things that I didn't put in here, but I think it's very true, is like there's an invisible social score for a lot of these virtual environments that give you a trust amount, so that in order to have dealing with harassment and abuse at scale, then if you have if these companies have a heuristic of this person who's flagged by being a potentially problematic user for whatever algorithm that for a good reason is completely made secret, because you don't want to game whatever that is, then every company that has people that they have to do this at scale have that. Well, what happens with that number gets into the hands of the government, and then that all of a sudden that number dictates whether or not you can have access to transportation or education. What's happening with the social scores in China, as an example? Like there could be directions where this is benefiting people for creating safe online spaces in that context. But if that same number is stripped of that context and then assigned to you as a U.S. citizen, that is dictating whether or not you can get on a flight or not. Well, that's another issue. So I think there's so many things where my big takeaway is the contextual nature of all this, and trying to define these different contexts and these different stakeholders and these different flows. And then also, like, it's hard to also map out all the potential harms until it's actually out there. And so to what degree do you like do the minority report, thought crimes, like prevent the harm before it's done, which could be, very beneficial, versus letting things play out and having faith in the culture at large of doing the right thing. And then when the culture doesn't do the right thing, then that's where you start to say, okay, there's going to be these other levers to pull with the laws or whatnot. So it goes back again to those 4 things that are feeding into this big complex nonlinear system. It's really difficult to predict. It's really difficult to model. And everybody is just, I think, the approach of the iteration is the thing that I keep coming for each of these issues. There's a bit of an iterative approach, but it's also been to the point where the XR market's matured enough where it's like, do we know enough to be able to put forth some very declarative, like, design, ethical design principles to say, these are some guidelines for if you're doing this, that you should be aware of these things. Because people are coming in from the medical industry and they have social VR, then, should a medical application have prevent harassment or personal space bubble? There could be things like that where things could be discovered within the social VR context, but then medical VR application developers should know because there's an interdisciplinary fusion of all these different things. And I think that's the other challenge, is all the different disciplines, all these different things that need to be tied together. Oh, wait, I think you might be muted, Robert.
Of course. With the remaining minutes that we have now left, I wanted to sort of like give people a sense of like hope in a way that they can something they can start now, something they can look into, start working forward to. So really quick, for the people who are watching, who are concerned about their communities, who are concerned about like being creators in a world that is now sort of starting to change and be where all this data is sort of let loose, what can the average person do, either through education or through moving forward, or even just like putting together, helping to like bring together communities? And I'll start with you, Fifer. Is there something like just very simple off the top of your head that you think people can work on right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's everybody has a role to play. I think for folks who are, working in the development space, it's really important. And I know this can be really hard, but it is really important to foster an environment at work where people can bring up issues and can talk about the impact of their work. And like simultaneously to that, bring up these things. Like I was on a team that was talking about developing some AR filters, and we were talking about, we're looking at what kinds of AR filters were very popular, and it was a lot of facial augmentation stuff. And I was like, we should have a discussion around like, how does this affect people? And I've like read articles about how this affects women, and how like people are actually going into like plastic surgeons and being like, hey, can you actually make me look like this? And like that's just really disappointing, and I don't want to contribute to that. And it's not to say it's necessarily bad. I think like this whole conversation is also kind of tricky, because I also don't think that people should be held back from creating these things. So I think that mostly like the best thing that we can do is ask questions and create work environments that are safe enough to ask these questions, and really be thoughtful about like exercise foresight. Like, what is the impact of this going to be? Yeah, I think like that from the professional level, that's the best policy. Yeah, for students, I would say like and we're all students in a way, like there's tons of amazing books on this, and I would definitely encourage like reading and watching these things, diving into that.
Excellent. I think we're almost at time. I want to make sure that we can keep this communication going. I think a lot of people in the chat right now are asking about like, they're pretty much like, how can we learn more about this? Where do we find out, how to do it? How can we follow you? So Kent, if people want to follow you, follow your work, see what else is going on out there, where can they find you, or where would you be able to point them?
Yeah, so I point them to my Twitter @KentBuy. That's my name @KentBuy on Twitter. My pinned tweet actually has like a list of different pointers to different things like the IEEE's Global Initiative on the Ethics of Extended Reality. Actually, I'll share a quick thing here on the screen. Just if people are interested, there's a email that you can send here, xr-ethics-share@IEEE.org. If you want to get involved, if you're really like want to be involved in the Discord and the producing a white paper that explores all this, you can go there and explore that. XR-share-ethics. And then the Voices of VR podcast, where I've been just having conversations like this. I think the last couple of episodes, like I talked to a human rights lawyer talking about how there's a lot of this biometric information that isn't defined by any of the laws. So we need to define new concepts like biometric psychography, and then figuring out how to make model laws with this new concept, just to make sure that this data are protected. Or talking to the director of Facebook Reality Labs neuromotor interfaces. So having these control labs, EMG interfaces, and having access to our motor neurons, and what are the implications of being able to have access to that amount of information, and just being in dialogue with these different companies, talking about these different issues. And I think if you're interested in from the design perspective, there's books like Design Justice is a great book. And if you just search up like virtual reality ethics, there's a number of different papers that are out there. And yeah, hopefully within the next 5 to 6 months or so, the IEEE will be producing like a white paper and hopefully digesting a lot of this stuff, so that there'll be like a canonical resource for people to look to. Because right now it's really like a lot of patchwork of ways of get references, because this is like a new area. And because the technology is new, there's all these new issues that come up that haven't been fully, articulated or mapped out, or there's not a lot of other resources out there aside from folks that are kind of digging into this, and certainly different disciplines, each from their own lens, but to sort of tie it all together, I think is something that's relatively new. And so that's part of the reason why I've been covering it on my podcast.
Excellent. And Fifer?
Yeah, I just wanted to end by saying that we did touch on a lot of the risks, and this can feel very sort of dystopian and like negative, but like VR is obviously such an incredible powerful medium as well, and offers people these incredible opportunities, whether that's like stroke rehabilitation that was not at all possible before, or being able to connect with people in different parts of the world in a way that wasn't. VR is so amazing, and the reason that we like try to bring these topics up is to help ensure that the space like moves in a positive direction.
Absolutely. Thank you both for being on here. It was a lot of information, but let me tell you, these are a lot of great questions that I had not even begun to think about when it came to the VR, AR, XR world that's out there. And hopefully we have encouraged other people out there to start asking those questions, and hopefully make better communities out there, both in development as well as just being a consumer of the VR world. So thank you both very much. And up next, we are going to talk about community and streaming with Hyper in just a couple of minutes. So stay tuned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.